Wagwan, everybody. Welcome to the Dis Affamie History podcast, where we'll be speaking about history and as well family history and how history relates in terms of Caribbean people for the present as well as in the past, and how in the past what that does and brings forth for what we are going through at present and what we can learn from our history, from our family, and take that moving forward. So I do hope you enjoy the podcast. And if you like it, please ensure to subscribe, like, and review. Thank you.
What happens when a people, their land, and their culture collide with the brutal weight of colonialism? The Garifuna of St. Vincent know this story too well. Torn from their homeland, scattered across the Caribbean and Central America, their history is marked by displacement, but also by survival, resilience, and cultural strength. In today's episode, we explore Maria Fernanda de Almeida's powerful work, the consequences of colonialism to the history and lives of the Garifuna people of St. Vincent. From the violence of exile to the preservation of identity, we ask, what can the story of the Garifuna teach us about resistance, memory, and belonging? Stay with us as we uncover a history that continues to shape lives today.
So today on the podcast, we have Maria Fernanda de Almeida on here talking about the consequences of colonialism to the history and the lives of the Garifuna people of St. Vincent. And so before we start, I'll just have Maria just do a brief introduction of yourself.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. My name is Maria, and I've studied Caribbean history during my undergrad and then at University of Toronto. And then I went to do my master's in global affairs. And I've always been fascinated by Latin American and Caribbean history. And I think it's just so important for you to have the privilege to study, especially collective memory, and the importance that it has in maintaining culture, especially after seeing the consequences of colonization and how it is important in maintaining and preserving culture of not only African descent, but also Latin American descent as well.
Yes, no, thank you so much for that. And would you be able to share, I guess, some of the historical origins of the Garifuna people and how their culture dates back to the bleeding of African and indigenous Arawak heritage?
Yes, for sure. So the historical origins of the Garifuna, you can date back to 1635 on the island of St. Vincent. So their unique culture was forged through a profound bleeding of African and Arawak and Caribbean influences. In that sense, it began with two ships carrying enslaved Africans to the West Indies, which were shipwrecked near the island, right? And these survivors, they form crucial alliances with the indigenous people already living there and establishing themselves within the existing community. So these enslaved Africans who had survived these shipwrecks are considered the first non-American group to settle on the island, and significantly were also among the first to resist European colonizers later on. But the shipwreck story is deeply rooted as a part of the Garifuna oral tradition and collective memory, shaping their identity. However, there's also historical accounts that offer different perspectives. So some theories suggest that Africans were either captured in slave raids by the indigenous Caribs from the European settlements or arrived as runaways from nearby islands. And then they would subsequently be incorporated into the indigenous societies. But regardless of the circumstances of their arrival, we can say that by the mid-17th century, there was a significant population of Africans that had integrated into the indigenous communities on St. Vincent. And that resulted later on in the new group that we call Garifuna now. And they have this ancestral culture and language.
Which is just amazing. And, how has their, I guess, oral tradition helped preserve the Garifuna origin story over generations?
Mm-hmm. Well, I can say that the oral tradition has been paramount in preserving their culture. It serves as a vital, incredible repository of their story, particularly because of the absence or manipulation of written records by colonial powers. So this narrative of the shipwrecked being welcome and forming alliances with indigenous communities is a cornerstone part of their oral tradition. And some other scholars like Joseph Palacio, that you study a lot and talks about the Caribbean history, he emphasizes the Garifuna oral tradition is instrumental in filling historical gaps that we have and provides credible accounts that often align with or even precede scientific historical research. So their reliance on oral history is crucial for challenging the false historical narrative that was created by the colonizers and for telling what we call the true story from their Garifuna point of view. So this continuous oral transmission ensures that their story remains alive and foster their cultural revival and straight their connections that they have across their diaspora.
No, definitely. And I guess, before European colonization, what was life like for the Garifuna people in
Mhm.
St. Vincent?
Yeah, so before the Europeans arrived in the island, the indigenous inhabitants there, they were known as Calipona, or what later the Spanish and the British called as Caribs. And they lived a very distinct life. These were well-established communities, and their lifestyle was primarily sedentary. They focused on agriculture and fishing, and they had a very comfortable existence. They would call the island Yuruman, which we can translate it to homeland right now, and that served as a Caribbean republic or a refuge for other refugees who would come from other imperial-controlled islands, right? So that indicated that they had a self-governing status and resistance to outside influence. Later on, we find out that they were so known as this fierce defendants of their territory that the Spanish would characterize any other hostile group as Caribs because of that, right? So the Kalipona already possessed their own developed language, and which later on we would see as the main foundation for the Garifuna who would form. And by the time that the Europeans came in 1490s, that's when what they found out. It's peaceful indigenous community, which later would have to be aggressively disputing the control of their island.
Yeah, but it's just very interesting when you said that anybody that was kind of, I guess, aggressive or violent, they were described as being Caribs, so against the colonial powers. So, how did early encounters with colonial powers begin to reshape the Garifuna society?
hmm I think the first thing we can say is the introduction of conflict and violence. So, as I said, it was very peaceful, even with other people, runaways, refugees coming to the island, they would be integrated peacefully. But with the arrival of the Spanish and then later British and French, there was starting to form powered disputation, right? So these European nations, they wanted the control of the island for economic gains. So they would lead attacks on the local population and initiated a lot of devastating conflict. So the first one was the 7 Years' War, which was against the British. And then later on, this will lead to the First and Second Caribbean Wars. There was also genocide and cultural erasure during that time. So the European colonial interests, particularly their desire to establish sugar plantations and perpetuate slavery, influenced the genocide of the Caribs and their attempt to their cultural erasure. And with that, there was also the creation of negative stereotypes and false narratives, in the sense that these colonial powers will systematically create negative stereotypes associated with the indigenous peoples, such as branding them as hostile, cannibals, in ways to justify their forced land acquisition. They also propagated academic literature based on false narratives of the Garifuna stories, twisting their story to serve as colonial financial interests, which also led to this type of racial reclassification and division. So, as I said before, the Spanish coined the term Carib, but it was later used by the British to differentiate the indigenous groups, which were then characterized as red Caribs, from the African descents, which would be the black Caribs, right? And this aimed to alienate and portray the African descents in a negative way. And the intensifying this terminology was a way to create an ideological strategy to validate their conquest of land. However, We also see during that time a formation of new alliances. So in response to this European encroachment, we see the indigenous Caribs adapted, incorporating runaway Africans from nearby British colonies into their numbers, which also led to a significant democratic shift and the formation of multiracial Carib Republic. So at that time, there was also an increase in the population, no way to resist this imperial control.
Wow. It's just so interesting. And then, would you be able to talk about the events that led to the exile of the Garifuna from St. Vincent?
For sure. So following the 7 Years' War, the British formally acquired the island of St. Vincent, and that was in 1763. And that triggered a resistance from the indigenous Caribs, who, as I said, had long maintained their autonomy. So that ended up leading to two major resistant conflicts. So the first one was the First Carib War, which was from 1772 to 1773. And this war erupted when the British began surveying and selling land on the western side of the island, which was the heart of the Carib territory by that point. So despite the Caribs' superior knowledge of the mountains and the land, they were eventually forced to sign a treaty in 1773. And this treaty significantly reduced their land holdings and formally declared them subjects to the British crown. And this then would lead a few years later in 1795 for them to resist again and initiating the Second Carib War, which lasted a whole year. And this unfortunately marked the final desperate struggle for the Garifuna to try to retain their land and autonomy. So amidst this revolutionary turmoil in the Atlantic, the Garifuna aligned with French forces and other French settlers and enslaved Africans on St. Vincent, and they launched an anti-colonial war, burning plantations and engaging in fierce battles against the British, right? And that's when we start seeing the resurgence of national heroes, such as the key Garifuna leader Joseph Chantoyar, who later on we would see him actually becoming a national hero in St. Vincent. He was killed in the wars, and this was a significant blow for them because then we see the Britain ultimately prevailing and destroying all Carib provisions, and that led to widespread starvation and death among the Garifuna.
Wow. And then how have the Garifuna maintained their language, music, and spiritual practices despite being displaced and, of course, in the diaspora?
Mm-hmm. So the Garifuna people have demonstrated extraordinary resilience in maintaining their language, music, and spiritual practices, despite centuries of displacement, cultural genocide, and diaspora. So they have the language as their defining feature. This means that the Garifuna language is not merely a means of communication, but is also considered core cultural trait and a symbol of their distinct identity. So it stands out as the only ancestral African language maintained for everyday use by an African descendant group in the New World. And many Garifuna adults actively speak their language at home, and they also encourage their children to learn it, even if they believe that in the outside world it's not going to be used, especially in villages such as Belize, right? Children still acquire Garifuna as their first language at home. In Central American countries, there's also the glossic situation that we've seen emerge where the Garifuna has used informal home and community settings, while, as I said, outside they use informal public domains, they use more Spanish or English. But that's a strategy that helped them preserve the language in its core context, right? We also have been seeing formalization efforts. So there are ongoing efforts by Garifuna organizations to develop standardized orthographies and create educational materials, such as textbooks and other literary ways to support language acquisition as well. And also a way to maintain and continue their historical records because of years of colonization where they didn't have a say and there was so many negative and false narratives being spread out, right?
Yeah.
When you talk about music and dance, they are deeply embedded in their identity and they see they serve as powerful vehicles for cultural expression and historical memory as well. There is a great community connection to dance, music, food, and traditional instruments as well that are used in celebrations to remind others of the past and celebrate the future. For example, I think it's also important to say the recent global recognition and advocacy that the Garifuna were able to receive. So, for example, we can cite the 2001 UNESCO proclamation of the Garifuna culture, language, and music. And they proclaimed it as a quote unquote masterpiece of the oral and intangible heritage of humanity. That's what they call it. And it has given them this global visibility and even strengthened their efforts for cultural preservation. So, even though governments in their host countries have also begun to implement reforms, such as I said, recognizing Joseph Chatoyer as a national hero and celebrating Indigenous Peoples Day, which also acknowledges their heritage.
Yeah, definitely. So I guess just going on that theme is, in what ways, again, does the colonial history still shape the lives of the Garifuna communities across Central America and, of course, the Caribbean?
So, unfortunately, they continue to endure in many challenging ways the consequences of this colonial history and oppression. We can see this through systemic racism and discrimination as a direct legacy of the colonialism. So they're often still viewed as outsiders or second-class citizens and reduced to these negative stereotypes that were built during colonial times, such as they are seen as being lazy, unmotivated, or untrustworthy, right? Which limits their opportunities. And their historical characterization as well of Caribs as cannibals still affects their perception today, especially on the island. We also see economic marginalization and land dispossession. So the colonial pursuit of economic gains, particularly, as I said, for their sugar plantations, led to the targeting and displacement of the Garifuna from their ancestral lands. And this history continues to manifest in ongoing land ownership struggles and dispossession. Many Garifuna communities still experience poverty and heavily rely on remittances from relatives abroad. We also see political exclusion and lack of recognition. So, despite official recognition as an indigenous ethnic group in some countries, the Garifuna identity and specific cultural needs are often included but politically excluded in national discourse and legislation, right? So, policies frequently prioritize the recognition of these indigenous groups but overlook their distinct heritage, which also leads to internalized identity struggles and language shame. So, their historical imposition of negative identities and this pressure to assimilate them have at times led to the internalized struggles with their own identity. So, in past decades, some Garifunas have said to feel shame about speaking their language or denied their African heritage in an effort to avoid discrimination. And of course, there is underdevelopment and isolation coming from that. So many Garifuna communities remain isolated and vulnerable to environmental and infrastructure challenges, such as dangerous rivers crossing without bridges, which we've seen in St. Vincent, reflecting a continued lack of governmental investment and legacy of neglect. So, for example, they have to cross dangerous paths to go to the capital in St. Vincent. And this has been a continuous struggle, and is still the government fails to actually provide infrastructure investment to help these people. And then finally, there is a complex identity in transnational movements. So the unique blend of indigenous and African identities places them within a broader transnational movements for both indigenous rights and Afro-descendant recognition, which also adds to this complexity of their ongoing struggles for belonging and justice.
Mm. Definitely. And I guess this just relates to, for the younger generation engaging with Garifuna heritage in the 21st century. How is that, being incorporated or being done for them?
As I mentioned, we've seen the Garifuna descendants dealing with a lot of shame and feeling of neglect, but there was also this resurgence of renewed pride and cultural adaptation. especially in the younger generation. So they have been influenced by broader movements such as the Black Power movement and the rise of African American hip hop culture, especially in the 80s. So now we see that they're more visibly proud of their African roots, and this pride is expressed through vibrant cultural forms like different music genres such as Ponta or Ponta Rock, which is what they call it. And they are actively organizing associations, brotherhoods, and clubs to promote their heritage. There's also language maintenance efforts. While we see some youths in areas like Puerto Barrios, they may still exhibit some language shame or being boast about not speaking Garifuna language. But we also see others are actively involved in preserving the language. So in communities such as Hopkins Village in Belize, we've seen children continuing to learn the language because they're being boosted by local pride and the local popularity of the Punta Rock music. So we've seen these efforts that are being able to improve Garifuna orthography as well, and they've been able to implement and bring together younger generations in learning to read and write on their home language.
Which is very important for it to continue onwards. And, for you, when researching this history, did you draw on the archives in St. Vincent, Belize, Honduras, or other U.S. repositories at all?
So for my research, specifically the article that I wrote, I synthesized more published scholarship and documentary sources rather than conducting an archival fieldwork. But I've also looked into colonial reports and primary sources as well as contemporary ethnographies and a documentary as well. There's the Euroman documentary by Andrea Leland, and it's a documentary that explore this Garifuna descendants coming back to San Vincent to visit their ancestors' land for the first time, and we can see a fusion of culture and customs occur as the film shows interviews with the people and how they're still affected by many negative stereotypes and rumors that were created in the colonial times. But I would say that for anyone who has the opportunity to access different types of archives, of course, as you mentioned, we have the Caribbean archives, particularly for San Vincent. We also have the Central American archives, which is in Guatemala City. And there they hold records pertinent to the Garifuna's arrival and settlement in Central America. There's also the European archives. And that's, we can see there's a lot of documents that are critical, detailing colonial administration and conflict, especially between the Caribs and the Spanish, and then later the French and British, right? In terms of the US, there are many academic institutions and specialized collections in the US house, significant researching and publishing works, and having attempts of digitizing historical documents. So you can also find that online, for sure, including on the transatlantic slave trade database that you can find. And that's where you can also access a lot of this story and there's different points of view in the Garifuna history.
No, that's great, because just to know that there are different avenues that you can use to research is always great. And I guess, this goes into my next question in terms of how can access to historical records really empower the Garifuna community in reclaiming their narrative?
Yeah, I think the main thing would be challenging and correcting colonial biases, right? So historical records, especially those from non-colonial perspectives, allow the Garifuna to directly challenge the false narratives and negative stereotypes that the colonizers disseminated. So for centuries, the history of the Garifuna was written by Europeans to serve their own economic and political interests, often portraying them negatively to justify the land appropriation, right? As I said. So access to diverse records enables them to dismantle these fabrications. And this consequently leads to restoring and validating historical memory as well. So by uncovering accurate historical information, the community can restore and rebuild their own historical memory, which is also crucial for self-recognition and cultural pride. So this process can validate their heritage and affirm their resilience as well. And in a way, it can also inform education and identity formation. So as they have access to authenticated records, they can facilitate the creation of accurate educational materials that teach younger generations their true history. And later on, it can also empower local initiatives, increasing awareness through historical records and cultural revitalization as well. So you see a cycle of, as they gain more knowledge of their own story, it can also promote more awareness in different ways that they can empower and spread this knowledge, not only across their own community, but internationally as well.
Mm-hmm. No, definitely. And, Maria, I guess as we come to a close with this episode, if there's one thing you could share, like one lesson from the Garifuna history with the wider world, what would it be?
I think it would be just the extraordinary and enduring power of cultural resilience and the dynamic of a hybrid identity in the face of immense adversity and deliberate attempts at erasure that the Garifuna has faced. Their story really teaches us that culture is a form of sovereignty, even after war, exile, and erasure. These communities can protect freedom through language, ritual, and memory, and then use those living archives to rebuild rights and recognition.
Perfect. No, thank you so much for coming on to the podcast and speaking about this. It has been very, very informative. And again, I just definitely appreciate your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
You're welcome.
Hoped you enjoyed this episode, and if you did, please make sure to like, follow, subscribe, and write a review for the episode wherever you listen to your podcasts. Thank you.